In 1944, the skies over Europe burned with fire. From the coasts of France to the valleys of Italy, the air was alive with the thunder of engines and the rattle of machine guns. Up there, men fought and died without ever seeing the faces of those who killed them. Among them flew a group of Americans whose presence had once been treated as a joke, an experiment that many believed would fail before it began. They called them the Tuskegee Airmen, or more famously the Red Tails. German pilots laughed when they first heard of them. Black fighter pilots from Alabama, flying American Mustangs against the seasoned aces of the Luftwaffe? The idea seemed absurd, but before the war was over, the laughter would stop, replaced by something the Germans had not expected: respect and fear. By 1944, the Second World War had reached its most brutal phase. The Allied bombing campaign against Nazi Germany had turned the skies into a continuous battlefield. Every morning, vast armadas of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators rose from airfields in England and Italy, droning northward toward the factories, rail lines, and oil plants that sustained Hitler's war machine. From the ground, they looked like a slow-moving wall of silver. To the men inside, it was a different world: deafening engines, frozen oxygen masks, and the constant rattle of flak bursting around them like black flowers. They knew that every mission was a gamble. The Luftwaffe's fighter wings and the Jagdgeschwader were waiting. These were no ordinary opponents. By 1944, some German pilots had survived 5 years of continuous combat. They were veterans who measured their careers in kills. Men like Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Johannes Steinhoff. The Luftwaffe's aces were feared across the world, and their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s could still tear through bomber formations like wolves through sheep. To protect the bombers, the Allies relied on long-range fighter escorts. But here the problem had always been the same: endurance. The early escort fighters, the P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt, could not stay with the bombers all the way to their targets deep inside Germany. For hours at a time, the bomber crews had to face the enemy alone, watching helplessly as German fighters tore into their ranks. The solution came with the introduction of the P-51 Mustang, a sleek, elegant aircraft that combined American design with a British engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything the Luftwaffe could send against it. With drop tanks, it could accompany bombers from takeoff to target and back again. But the question remained: who would fly them? In the segregated America of the early 1940s, the idea of black pilots flying in combat had been ridiculed for decades. Military officials had argued, with breathtaking arrogance, that black men lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage to handle complex machines or command under pressure. The establishment's answer was the so-called Tuskegee experiment. In 1941, the U.S. Army Air Corps established a training program at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a historically black college. Officially, it was presented as a step toward inclusion. In reality, it was a test, one designed to confirm the prejudices of those who believed it would fail. The men who applied to Tuskegee understood that from the beginning. Every one of them carried not only the burden of mastering flight, but of disproving a nation's low expectations. Among them was a young officer named Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., son of one of the first black generals in the U.S. Army. Davis had graduated from West Point, where he endured 4 years of silence from his white classmates. They refused to speak to him except on official matters, a deliberate attempt to break him. It didn't work. Davis graduated in the top 20% of his class, determined to prove that discipline could overcome bigotry. At Tuskegee, the training was rigorous and unforgiving. Many of the early cadets washed out under the pressure, but those who remained forged a bond that went beyond friendship. They were, as one airman later said, a brotherhood held together by the knowledge that the country didn't believe in us. They trained in PT-17 biplanes, AT-6 Texans, and later the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, a rugged fighter that tested their reflexes and endurance. In the Alabama heat, they learned to fly, to navigate, to fight. Their instructors, many of them white officers initially skeptical of the program, soon began to change their tone. The men of Tuskegee were good, better in some cases than the cadets trained at standard bases, but proving themselves in training was one thing. Proving themselves in combat was another. In the spring of 1943, the 1st Black Fighter Unit, the 99th Fighter Squadron, was deployed to North Africa under Colonel Davis's command. They were attached to the 12th Air Force and assigned to support ground operations in Tunisia and Sicily. Their aircraft, the aging P-40 Warhawk, was slower and less agile than the German Messerschmitts they would face. The reception from other American units was mixed at best. White officers doubted their effectiveness and sometimes refused to fly missions with them. One general even demanded that the 99th be removed from combat, claiming they lacked aggressiveness. That accusation would haunt the unit, and Davis personally. He was summoned to Washington to defend his men before a skeptical board of officers. Standing ramrod straight in his uniform, he spoke without anger, without theatrics, and the only facts. The 99th, he said, had flown every mission assigned, had never broken formation, and had suffered casualties in doing so. "We will not be judged by rumor," he told them. "We will be judged by our record." That calm defiance marked Davis as a man to watch, and his squadron as something more than an experiment. In the months that followed, the 99th continued flying missions over Italy and the Mediterranean islands, bombing enemy positions, strafing convoys, and providing cover for Allied troops. Slowly, their record began to speak for itself. By early 1944, Higher Command made a decision that would change everything. The 99th would be joined by 3 more all-black squadrons, the 100th, 301st and 302nd, to form the 302nd Fighter Group. Their new base would be Ramitelli Airfield, a patch of muddy ground on Italy's Adriatic coast. From there, they would fly deep into enemy territory, escorting bombers on long-range missions over Austria, Hungary, and southern Germany. The bombers they protected soon noticed something. The Red Tails didn't abandon their posts. While other escort groups chased enemy fighters for personal glory, the Tuskegee pilots stayed with the bombers, no matter the temptation. Their aircraft, now gleaming with crimson-painted tails for identification, became a symbol of discipline and reliability. At first, the German pilots laughed when they saw them. The word spread quickly through Luftwaffe channels. Die Schwarzen Piloten and the black pilots were in the air. But laughter would soon turn to disbelief. By the summer of 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group was flying hundreds of missions across southern Europe. Their reputation among bomber crews was growing. They were not flashy. They did not boast. They simply did their job and did it well. Still, the war was changing. The Luftwaffe was battered, but far from beaten. The Germans were introducing new tactics, new aircraft, and increasingly desperate measures to stem the tide. For the Red Tails, the hardest days were still ahead, and as they prepared for those battles, they carried with them a knowledge few others could understand, that they were fighting 2 wars at once. One against the enemy in the sky, and one more insidious against the prejudice of their own country. The idea of training black pilots had not come easily to the US military. For decades, the armed forces had operated under the unspoken assumption that aviation was the preserve of white men, that courage and intellect somehow had a color. But by the late 1930s, the political winds were shifting. The threat of global war forced the Roosevelt administration to expand the armed forces, and civil rights groups saw their chance. Organizations like the NAACP and the Black Press began to push hard for inclusion. "If this is a war for democracy," one editorial wrote, "then democracy must start at home." Reluctantly, the War Department agreed to create a segregated training program. It would be an experiment, in separate but equal in name only. The location chosen was Tuskegee, Alabama, a place with a rich legacy of black education and a climate well suited for flying. On paper, the plan was a concession. In reality, it was a challenge. The first cadets arrived in 1941. They were young, ambitious, and acutely aware of the burden on their shoulders. Some were college graduates, others mechanics or flight enthusiasts who had scraped together civilian training hours before the war. All of them knew that one mistake, one crash, one failure would not be judged as personal, but racial among them were names that would later become legend: Charles McGee, Roscoe Brown, Lee Archer, and Daniel "Chappie" James. They trained under harsh conditions. The Alabama heat was relentless, the equipment outdated and the scrutiny constant. Every flight was observed, every report dissected, but there was also something else: pride. Many instructors, once skeptical, began to recognize the quality of these men. Their discipline was unmatched, their camaraderie unshakable. As one white officer admitted later, they couldn't afford to fail, and because of that, they didn't. When the first graduating class, 42C, received their wings, it was more than a military ceremony. It was a quiet revolution in uniform. Colonel Benjamin Oliver Davis Jr. was not a man given to grand speeches. He led through calm authority and relentless professionalism. For the men of Tuskegee, he was both a father figure and a symbol, proof that perseverance could outlast prejudice. Davis's leadership was built on a single principle: excellence as defiance. He told his pilots, "If we fail, they'll never let another colored man fly." That line became their creed. Under Davis, the 99th Fighter Squadron drilled endlessly. Formation flying, gunnery practice, navigation, and discipline became second nature. They knew that when the time came, they would be measured not only against the Luftwaffe, but against every doubt their nation had ever cast upon them. Still, resistance continued at every level. Supplies were slow to arrive, spare parts vanished in bureaucracy, and above all, rumors persisted that the entire program would soon be shut down. But Davis refused to yield. "We will fight where we are told," he said, "and we will fight well." In early 1943, his squadron was finally declared ready for combat. Orders came through. The 99th would deploy overseas to North Africa. Their first missions were far from glamorous. Flying the rugged P-40 Warhawk, the 99th was assigned to ground attack operations, dive-bombing enemy positions, and escorting medium bombers across the Mediterranean. The P-40 was durable but outdated. Against German Bf-109s, it was outclimbed and outgunned. Yet the men adapted. They learned to fight low, using surprise and teamwork to survive. On June 9, 1943, the 99th flew its first combat mission over Pantelleria, a rocky island fortress between Tunisia and Sicily. The skies were heavy with flak, and the sea below shimmered with tracer fire. It was the first time in American history that black pilots had engaged in aerial combat. They struck anti-aircraft positions and strafed supply convoys. One pilot described the experience later. "It wasn't courage. It was duty. You didn't think about being first or being black. You thought about getting back to base." Losses came quickly. Planes went down over the sea, over the desert. The 99th learned the hardest lesson of all, that war was an equal opportunity killer. But slowly their record began to speak for itself. They hit targets. They followed orders. They didn't break formation. And in the skies above the Mediterranean, something began to shift. White bomber crews who had once doubted them began to take notice. After one particularly brutal mission, a white officer sent a simple message to Davis: "Good job, boys." It was faint praise, but it was a start. Success could not silence prejudice overnight. By mid-1943, senior officers back in Washington were growing impatient. The 99th's kill count was modest, their missions mostly support-oriented. Critics seized on that as proof of failure. One of them was Colonel William Momia, commander of a white fighter group in the Mediterranean. He filed a report accusing the 99th of being ineffective and unfit for combat. It was an attack not just on their record, but on their right to exist. For Davis, it was a turning point. Summoned to Washington, he stood before a board of officers who questioned whether black men could handle modern warfare. Calmly, methodically, Davis dismantled every accusation. He presented mission reports, sortie statistics, and testimonials from bomber crews. "We have fulfilled every order given to us," he said. "If that is not success, then success has no meaning." The War Department postponed its decision. Meanwhile, the 99th continued to fly. In July 1943, during the invasion of Sicily, they scored their first confirmed air victory, downing a German Focke-Wulf 190. It wasn't just a kill, it was proof. The turning point came in early 1944. The 99th's steady performance, combined with growing public pressure from civil rights groups, forced the military's hand. 3 additional black squadrons were activated: the 100th, 301st, and 302nd. Together, They formed the 332nd Fighter Group. With Davis in overall command, their new aircraft would be the P-51 Mustang, the most advanced fighter in the Allied arsenal. Sleek, fast and deadly, it was everything the P-40 was not. And it was painted in a way no other aircraft was, with bright red tails that glowed against the blue Italian sky. To some, it was just a color. To the men who flew them, it was identity, a declaration that they were no longer an experiment, but warriors. At their base in Ramitelli, on Italy's Adriatic coast, the air buzzed with the sound of engines and laughter. Crews slept in tents, ate in mess halls and danced when they could. They called themselves the Red Tails with pride. Every dawn brought new missions, bomber escorts, dogfights and patrols stretching deep into enemy territory. And slowly their reputation began to grow. The bomber crews they protected began requesting them by name. "Give us the Red Tails," they'd say. "They stay with us." The Tuskegee Airmen had finally arrived. By the summer of 1944, the Red Tails were no longer a curiosity. They were a fighting force to be reckoned with. Their discipline set them apart. Their courage earned them respect. And their red-tailed Mustangs became a symbol of something larger, the quiet triumph of men who refused to be defined by others' limits. But as the war pressed north into the heart of Germany, the Luftwaffe grew more desperate. New planes, new tactics, and new dangers awaited the Red Tails. In the months to come, they would face the deadliest challenge of their lives, and, in doing so, write their names into history. In 1944, the skies over Europe burned with fire. Every dawn brought another mission, another test of courage and endurance. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group, known by now as the Red Tails, had proven themselves in training, but the war ahead would demand something greater than skill. It would demand faith. Faith in their machines, in their comrades, and in a country that did not yet fully believe in them. By the spring of that year, the Tuskegee Airmen were flying from Ramitelli Airfield in Italy, dusty, windswept, and crude, but it was home. The tents rattled in the sea breeze, and the air smelled of oil and hot metal. Each morning, pilots gathered for briefings inside a canvas hut, the air thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Missions were assigned, targets circled on maps, rail yards, oil depots, factories buried deep in enemy territory. Their orders were simple on paper: protect the bombers. In practice, it was hell. The German Luftwaffe still had teeth. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s prowled the skies, commanded by veterans who had fought since the early days of Blitzkrieg. For them, the black pilots of the 382nd were a curiosity, an insult even. The idea that African Americans could master high-performance aircraft seemed laughable to some of Germany's finest. But arrogance would soon meet reality. The Red Tails flew in tight formation, their discipline unmatched. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr.'s orders echoed before every takeoff. "You are not here for glory. You are here to protect the bombers," and they obeyed. When the first German interceptors dove on the formation, the Red Tails didn't scatter. They held the line. Their P-51 Mustangs climbed through flak and cloud, engines screaming, guns armed. One by one, they intercepted the attackers, sharp, controlled bursts of gunfire cutting through the chaos. Bomber crews watched from above, stunned. They had expected inexperienced escorts, but what they saw were professionals, men who fought with calm precision. Those red-tailed angels, one gunner would later call them, they never left us. Word began to spread across the 15th Air Force. Missions escorted by the 382nd suffered fewer losses than any other group. Only 27 bombers were lost under their protection across 179 escort runs. An almost impossible statistic in a war that devoured men and machines by the thousands. At first, some white crews doubted the numbers. Rumors claimed the Red Tails were getting easy routes, but those rumors died quickly. The 332nd was flying some of the most dangerous missions in the European theater: Vienna, Munich, Berlin, Ploiești, targets deep in the Reich's heart. Each sortie began the same way: the long climb into freezing air, the silence before contact, then the sudden storm of flak and gunfire. At 20,000 feet, the world shrank to a trembling cockpit. A heartbeat and the smell of oxygen and sweat. Frost lined the canopy glass. You couldn't think about fear, you could only fly. Then came the call over the radio. "Bandits, 10 o'clock high." The German fighters came fast, diving from the sun, cannons flashing. In that split second, everything became instinct. The Red Tails moved as one, cutting through the enemy attack, rolling, diving, pulling high G turns, until the sky became a violent ballet of smoke and tracer fire. And somehow the bombers kept flying. That discipline, Davis's doctrine of no chasing kills, became their defining strength. Other escort groups sometimes broke formation to score personal victories, leaving the bombers exposed. The 332nd never did. They stayed with their charges, even when it meant letting German fighters escape. Their restraint was often misunderstood as hesitation. In truth, it was control, a mastery of purpose that no statistic could measure. In July 1944, the Red Tails faced one of their toughest missions yet, an escort run over the Ploiești oil refineries in Romania. The refineries were the lifeblood of Hitler's war machine, and the Germans defended them like a fortress in the sky. As the bombers approached, black puffs of flak filled the air like deadly confetti. The sky turned into a blackened storm. Then the radio crackled. Enemy fighters inbound. Dozens of Messerschmitts dove from altitude. "Red flight, tighten up. Don't break off!" Davis's voice cut through the static. The Mustangs banked in formation, engines roaring. Cannon shells streaked past, shaking the planes. But the Red Tails didn't flinch. One pilot, Lieutenant Charles McGee, rolled into a head-on pass with a 109, squeezing the trigger at point-blank range. The German plane erupted into fire and fell in pieces through the smoke. For hours they fought, turning, diving, climbing again. By the end, the bombers made it home battered but intact. The Luftwaffe lost heavily. That day, for the first time, the German pilots stopped laughing. Reports filtered back through Allied channels. The Red Tails were no longer just an experiment. They were becoming legends. By late 1944, bomber crews began requesting them by name. "Get us the Red Tails," they'd say during mission briefings. "They bring us back." That respect was hard-won. When the Tuskegee men first arrived in Italy, they had been met with skepticism and sneers. Now at the officers' mess, crews who once refused to sit beside them would nod in quiet gratitude. Even within the Air Force, their achievements began to echo. Reports praised their exceptional discipline and record of protection, but the Red Tails themselves rarely celebrated. For every victory, there was a name missing at roll call. Men like Captain Andrew "Jug" Turner and Lieutenant Clarence "Lucky" Lester. Pilots who pushed their Mustangs beyond limits. Some returned with bullet holes in their wings. Others never came back at all. When a man failed to return, his bunk stayed untouched for a week. The others would gather in silence that night, passing around a tin cup of coffee, staring at the empty space that grief had carved into their circle. Colonel Davis would stand before them and remind them softly, "We fly for them now." On March 24, 1945, the Red Tails received a mission that would etch their place permanently into history, an escort run all the way to Berlin. It was the deepest penetration of enemy territory, yet attempted by the 15th Air Force. The skies over Germany that morning were pale blue and deceptively calm. Below, the bombers droned eastward toward the Reich's shattered capital. Above them, the Red Tails flew in staggered formation, red gleaming against the sun. Halfway to target, radar screens lit up. The Luftwaffe had scrambled its newest weapon, the Me-262 jet fighter, the first operational jet in history. The Me-262 was fast, nearly 200 miles per hour faster than any Allied plane. Its twin jet engines left white streaks through the sky, and its cannons could shred a bomber in seconds. But that day, even the jets met their match. As the Me-262 screamed into the bomber formation, two Red Tail pilots, Lieutenants Earl Lane and Roscoe Brown, broke formation just long enough to intercept. They angled into a dive, guns blazing. Brown's burst hit home, tearing into the tail of a jet as it tried to climb. Flames erupted. The world's most advanced fighter spiraled to Earth, brought down by a man whose country still denied him a seat in its restaurants. It was the moment that silenced the last of the doubters. The Red Tails had done the impossible. Victory came with a cost. Between 1944 and 1945, the 302nd flew over 15,000 sorties. 66 pilots were killed in action. 32 were captured as prisoners of war. And yet, despite the loss, their record stood unmatched. They destroyed more than 260 enemy aircraft, sank a German destroyer, and earned over 150 distinguished flying crosses. When the war finally ended and the guns fell silent, the Red Tails returned home to a country still divided by color. There were no parades waiting for them, no headlines celebrating their heroism. Many would go back to ordinary jobs, quietly carrying memories of fire and sky that the world around them could not understand. But within the bomber crews, within the hearts of those who had survived because of them, the name Tuskegee became sacred. Years later, historians would look back and call them pioneers. But for the men themselves, it had always been simpler than that. They had set out to prove that courage had no color. In time, the Red Tails' legacy would reach beyond the war. They broke open doors that others would later walk through. The desegregation of the US military, the rise of black officers, the slow, painful march toward equality. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. would go on to become the first African-American general in the US Air Force. And decades after the war, the men who once flew under him would gather at reunions old and gray, recalling the roar of engines and the sound of gunfire over Europe. "When we flew," one said softly, "we weren't fighting just the Germans. We were fighting the world's idea of what we could be." In 1944, the skies over Europe had burned with war. By 1945, they burned instead with the color red, the mark of courage, the symbol of men who refused to bow. The Red Tails had rewritten the rules of the air. And though time would fade their faces, the story of their discipline, honor, and defiance would never fall silent. In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was reaching its violent crescendo. The Allies had punched through Italy, France, and the Rhine, and now their eyes were fixed on the very heart of Hitler's empire. The 15th Air Force was preparing its most dangerous missions yet, deep strikes into Germany itself. For the 302nd Fighter Group, the Red Tails, this was the moment their years of endurance, discipline, and sacrifice would converge. Before dawn, Ramitelli Airfield stirred to life. Ground crews moved like ghosts in the dim light, checking oil lines, tightening bolts, and running final diagnostics under the cold Adriatic breeze. Pilots zipped up their flight suits, pulled on gloves stiff with wear, and carried with them quiet rituals. Some kissed a small photograph tucked into their flight log. Others just stood still for a moment, watching the sun bleed over the eastern hills. There was no ceremony to these mornings, only the sound of engines rumbling to life, first one, then another, until the air vibrated with a metallic chorus. Above the steady hum, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr.'s voice came calm and clipped through the radio. "Remember, gentlemen, our job is to bring those bombers home. Nothing else." The words needed no explanation. They had heard them hundreds of times before. Inside the briefing tent, a map of Europe was pinned to the wall, riddled with colored lines and grease pencil marks. The target, Berlin, not just any strike. This was to hit the capital's massive rail yards, the arteries feeding the German war machine. Intelligence warned that the Luftwaffe would defend it with everything they had left: Me-262 jets, FW-190s, Bf-109s, and perhaps even desperate flak batteries hidden between apartment blocks. Captain Charles A. Train Dryden leaned back in his chair, whistling low. "Berlin, huh? That's not just deep, it's hell's front porch." A few men chuckled softly, but the tension lingered. They knew the risks. Berlin wasn't just another target, it was symbolic both to the Germans and to the Allies. And now the Red Tails were being trusted with the escort. Outside, the Mustangs lined up like sentinels. The red paint on their tails gleamed faintly under the pale sun, part pride, part defiance. The white crews who once refused their protection now requested them by name. The transformation was almost complete. The takeoff rolled like thunder over the Italian hills. Dozens of P-51s leapt into the air, joining formations of B-17s and B-24s, already climbing toward the clouds. The sky above the Adriatic turned silver with contrails, ribbons of ice and exhaust stretching north. At 20,000 feet, the world was stripped of color, only gray and blinding white. The radio crackled with constant chatter, interlaced with bursts of static. "Red Leader, this is Blue 3, maintaining position." "Copy that, Blue 3. Eyes open, boys." We're in their backyard now. Over the Alps, the horizon began to change. Below lay the scarred earth of southern Germany. Rail lines cut, bridges shattered, towns burned. But Berlin was still ahead, and with every mile the flak grew thicker. It started as a shimmer on the horizon. Tiny black dots against the pale sky, growing, multiplying. Then came the radio call. Bandits. 11 o'clock high. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Dozens of Mi-109s dove from the clouds, sunlight flashing off their wings, tracers stitched across the sky. The first burst caught a bomber on the right flank. One engine burst into flame, spiraling smoke over the formation. The Red Tails didn't flinch. Their formation tightened. Colonel Davis's voice stayed calm. Stay with the heavies. No chasing. Protect the formation. Linnie Roscoe Brown spotted a Mi-109 cutting through the bombers. He pushed his throttle forward, pulled into a climbing turn and lined up his shot. Got him in sight, firing. The Mustang's guns roared, 650 caliber streams of fire reaching out like white-hot threads. The Messerschmitt exploded mid-roll, breaking into fragments that vanished into cloud. The discipline held. No one broke formation to chase kills. One bomber crew later recalled over the intercom, "Those Red Tails stayed right with us like guardian angels." Then came something new. Fast-moving silver shapes tore through the bomber columns. Jets. The feared Messerschmitt Mi-262s, the world's first operational jet fighters. Their speed was unlike anything the Red Tails had faced before. "Jesus, they're fast," someone shouted over the radio. The jets slashed through the formation, firing their 30mm cannons, then climbed steeply away. One bomber vanished in a single burst, its wings sheared clean off. Panic rippled through the sky, but Davis kept his composure. Ignore the speed, anticipate their path. Make them come to you. Brown and his wingman angled upward, turning into the jet's dive rather than chasing. Timing it perfectly, Brown fired a burst as a Mi-262 crossed his line of sight. The rounds tore through the fuselage. The jet wobbled, then exploded into a ball of flame. It was one of the first jet kills credited to a Tuskegee pilot. The Luftwaffe had underestimated them again. As the bombers reached Berlin, the sky erupted. Black flak bursts filled the air like storm clouds. Below, the city burned. The B-17s opened their bomb bays, releasing payloads that tumbled down into the inferno. Bridges, rail yards, and factories vanished under fire and smoke. The Red Tails circled high above, keeping the German fighters at bay. From the cockpit, the view was apocalyptic. Columns of smoke rising miles high, flashes of orange through the haze. For a moment, even the hardened pilots were struck silent. They had come so far, from Alabama's segregation to Berlin's heart, and now they were the shield of an empire at war with itself. Down in Berlin, civilians watched the chaos unfold. In a street near Tempelhof, a young German woman clutched her daughter as the sirens wailed. She looked up, seeing streaks of silver against the smoke, tiny planes with red tails flashing in the sun. Her husband, once a Luftwaffe mechanic, whispered under his breath, "Those are the black pilots they laughed about." The irony cut deep. Propaganda had called them inferior, but now they owned the sky. In the chaos of the city, even German soldiers paused to stare upward as the unthinkable unfolded. The very symbol of Nazi supremacy crumbling under an onslaught led, in part, by the men they had mocked. The mission wasn't over. On the way back, German fighters regrouped, harassing the retreating bombers. But the Red Tails stayed firm, even as fuel ran low and the cold gnawed at their hands. Over the radio, exhaustion set in. Red leader to base. "We've lost 2, repeat 2, but formation intact. Bombers returning safe." "Copy that, Red leader. Godspeed home." When the coast of Italy came into view hours later, the men finally exhaled. The sea sparkled below, and Ramitelli waited like a mirage in the haze. Landing gear locked. Wheels screeched against dirt. Engines died one by one, replaced by the sound of wind and the sighs of men who had stared into death and returned. On the ground, the crew chiefs ran to meet them. Some pilots climbed out wordlessly. Others patted their Mustangs like faithful steeds. The Red Tails, streaked with oil and soot, glowed faintly under the afternoon sun. Inside the mess tent, the air was thick with smoke and fatigue. The debriefing officer took notes as Davis stood, hands behind his back. 27 bombers escorted. 2 lost. Enemy fighters destroyed, 8 confirmed. 1 jet probable. A murmur went through the room, an extraordinary record. But Davis said little. His eyes were heavy. He simply nodded and dismissed his men with quiet pride. Later that night, the airmen gathered outside their tents. The Adriatic breeze carried the faint sound of waves. Someone strummed a guitar. No speeches, no fanfare, just laughter, relief, and a kind of tired joy. Lee Archer looked up at the stars. "We did it," he murmured. "They can't deny us now." Beside him, another pilot whispered, "Yeah. But how many more before it ends?" They both fell silent. For all the pride, the war still had one more cruel twist to deliver. Weeks later, news spread that Germany had surrendered. Berlin was a ruin. The Luftwaffe was gone. The war was over. When the Red Tails flew their final mission, an uneventful escort run to Czechoslovakia, the air felt strangely quiet. No flak, no enemy fighters, just clouds and wind and memory. As the formation turned south toward Italy, Colonel Davis looked down at the landscape passing below. Fields, rivers, burned-out towns, the ghosts of all they'd fought through. He thought of the laughter in Luftwaffe briefings, the same men who'd once sneered at the idea of black fighter pilots. He thought of the Alabama sun, of cadets standing at attention under a sky that had once seemed impossibly far away. Now, that same sky carried their names forever. When they landed, Davis stood by the runway and watched his men taxi in. Some raised their fists, others saluted. No words were needed. The Red Tails gleamed one last time in the Italian light, symbols not just of a squadron, but of a transformation that stretched across history itself. By the spring of 1945, the war that had once seemed endless was finally contracting. The Luftwaffe, once master of Europe's skies, was a shadow of its former self. German cities lay in ruin, their airfields cratered, their factories silent except for the slow clatter of retreat. For the men of the 332nd Fighter Group, victory did not arrive with fanfare but with exhaustion. They had survived the long winter of attrition, and as the front advanced into Germany itself, they watched the enemy's resistance collapse under the combined weight of Allied might. In those closing months, the Red Tails continued to fly escort missions, sometimes over landscapes already conquered. Their pilots knew that each sortie could be their last, even as the war's end appeared visible beyond the horizon. They guarded the lumbering bombers to Berlin and back, sweeping above the Elbe, where columns of smoke rose like grey pillars of penance. Below, civilians fled the cities, and German soldiers threw down their rifles, hoping to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. Yet still, now and again, a solitary Fu-190 or Me-262 streaked through the clouds, as if unwilling to concede that the Reich had died. For the Tuskegee Airmen, these fleeting encounters carried a strange melancholy. They no longer fought for tactical advantage, but to finish a story written in sacrifice. Every loss now felt doubly cruel because peace was so near. When Lieutenant Roscoe Brown shot down a jet over Berlin in March, he later admitted he felt no triumph, only a dull, weary relief. In that moment, he understood the paradox of soldiers. Victory never erases the burden of those left behind. Their red-tailed P-51s became familiar even to enemy eyes. German pilots, once contemptuous of the colored squadron, had learned to respect them. Some prisoners even confessed after capture that the sight of crimson rudders meant a fight they rarely survived. Among Allied crews, the legend had become gospel. If the Red Tails were overhead, you'd make it home. Bomber crews would glance out of their plexiglass turrets and whisper quiet gratitude into their oxygen masks when they saw the gleam of red wings beside them. On the ground, however, the contrast was sharp. When the airmen returned to their base at Ramitelli, they found the same segregated facilities, the same narrow-eyed officers who refused to dine beside them. Even as they became war heroes, they were still confined by the invisible borders of prejudice. One mechanic recalled watching a German POW sit in a whites-only section, while black pilots who had risked their lives were told to eat elsewhere. The irony was bitter, but the men endured it in silence, their discipline a quiet form of rebellion. By April, as Hitler's regime crumbled, the Red Tails flew their last missions into the heart of Germany. They saw the smoking wreckage of rail yards, the endless trails of refugees trudging west, and rivers choked with the debris of a fallen nation. For many, those final flights felt almost ceremonial, escorting bombers not out of necessity, but out of duty, ensuring that the war ended as cleanly as possible. They'd come so far from the dusty runways of Alabama, from a world that doubted they could fly at all. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the celebration at Ramitelli was subdued. There was no champagne, no parade, just a handful of weary men who gathered near the flight line, watching the sunset over the Adriatic. The red tails of their mustangs glowed faintly in the evening light, symbols of both triumph and restraint. They had won every challenge placed before them, yet knew that the battle for respect was far from over. Returning home proved more disorienting than combat. Many expected welcome. Instead, they met the same divided America they had left behind. In railway stations and diners, signs still separated colored from white. A few veterans wore their uniforms proudly, only to be asked to remove them in towns that refused to serve them. One pilot later wrote, "It was easier to face a Messerschmitt than to face a country that still saw me as less than a man." The contrast between their valor abroad and indignity at home was a wound deeper than any inflicted in battle. Yet from those years of disappointment, purpose grew. The Tuskegee Airmen carried themselves with the same discipline that had defined their service. They lectured in schools, trained younger pilots, and pushed persistently for integration in the armed forces. In 1948, when President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially ending segregation in the U.S. military, many saw it as the belated recognition of the Red Tails' moral victory. The order did not erase prejudice, but it opened the door, and the men who had flown through flak and fire had forced that door wide enough for others to follow. The years after the war scattered them across America. Some pursued aviation careers. Others became teachers, engineers, or ministers. They raised families, built communities, and lived quietly, their fame receding as the world moved on. But among historians, their story persisted, a fragment of moral clarity amid the wider chaos of the 20th century. The Red Tails had proved with undeniable precision that courage and competence were never matters of color. In later decades, filmmakers and writers sought to capture their story, often missing the quiet dignity that defined it. The surviving pilots, now elderly, would speak softly at reunions, recalling comrades lost and skies once filled with thunder. They described how fear was constant, but how professionalism always overrode panic. And as they spoke, younger generations listened, not only to tales of dogfights, but to lessons in endurance and self-respect. There were moments of belated recognition. In 2007, 62 years after the war, surviving Tuskegee Airmen received the Congressional Gold Medal. They stood in their scarlet jackets beneath the dome of the Capitol, the applause rising like the sound of distant engines. Many were frail, but their posture was unchanged, straight-backed, formal, still carrying the discipline of their youth. Reporters asked what the honor meant. One veteran replied quietly, "It means we were finally seen." But perhaps the truest tribute lies not in medals, but in the generations that followed. When America sent men to Korea, to Vietnam, to the Gulf, and finally beyond Earth's atmosphere, it did so with aviators whose opportunities had been born from Tuskegee's example. The line runs unbroken, from the red-tailed Mustangs over Berlin to the astronauts who carried patches embroidered with crimson wings. The airman's spirit had become institutional memory, shaping the ethos of equality within the modern Air Force. There is, too, a quieter measure of their triumph. It lives in the ordinary acts of consequence, a child who learns of the Tuskegee pilots and dreams of flight, a scholarship named in their honor, a classroom where their story is told not as an exception, but as part of the American fabric. History, once reluctant, now embraces them fully. The Red Tails are no longer a footnote. They are a chapter in the long narrative of a nation learning, painfully, to live up to its ideals. And so as the final images fade, we return to the sky, their element, their testimony. High above the clouds, the Red Tails gleam once more in memory, cutting across the light like brushstrokes of defiance. They flew for country, for comradeship, and in ways they might not have articulated, for the idea that dignity has no color. Their legacy endures wherever courage challenges prejudice, and wherever men and women look upward and believe they too can rise.